Good morning, Kevin Keller here, field agronomist out of South Central Nebraska with Pioneer. Just wanted to share with you guys kind of the outlook for the next 10 days and just maybe help answer some of the questions around some of the planting intentions out there, even some of the other intentions when it comes to, hey, should I water, some of these soil conditions, some of the fields that I planted already, some of the fields that I intend to plant. So hit on a little bit of that here. So the next 10-day forecast here, this is out of Holders, Nebraska with Weather Underground. And Holders, Nebraska is the central area of my territory that I cover. So this is fairly representative, I think, what we're going to be seeing. As you can see, next 2 nights, looking at some lows of around 25. Most of these days in the 10-day are ranging from roughly in the 50s to maybe 60s, but a lot of those lows still hanging around the 30s overall. So I pulled that together to see, what does that look like over the next 10 days? So here's just a little Excel sheet I put together. Running that scenario. So you can see here on the right-hand column where it has total. This is a running total of GDUs across those 10 days. So at the 10-day mark, with the forecast at hand, we're looking at about 35 GDUs. Now, it takes around 120 GDUs to get that seed up and out of the ground, give or take maybe around 30 GDUs if we have, really good conventional till soils out there. Maybe it may take a little bit less, maybe in that more than 90 GDUs, but with our soil temperatures fluctuating as much as they are, I wouldn't necessarily count on that. I would say we're going to be closer to that 120. And if conditions aren't as good, I would say maybe even longer than that. So I ran a little bit of a scenario to say, okay, what about the next 7 days roughly after that? And if we got back to more of our seasonal temperatures, for maybe that first part of May, and or some pretty good temperatures ranging from maybe the mid 60s to I did throw a high in there like we saw last week of 87, and that's essentially what it would take for us to get to around 120 GDUs. So we were looking at about May 7th if that corn is in the ground today. Now, we have recommended not to have corn in the ground, roughly that 36 to 48 hours ahead of this low temperature. Which I have 50 in there because of the GDU calculation only allows for a low of 50, but looking at that low of 25, we want to make sure to stay away from that. Just the chance of some inhabitual chilling. First water that seed takes on to germinate it can be fairly sensitive, and we can rupture cells if we get into some cooler conditions, especially by the time we get into maybe some of the mid 40s soil temperatures or lower. That is always a little bit of a watch out. Now, one caveat to that, I would say in my experience over the last several years is that we have looked out for this. I will say that, in the right conditions and so forth, we can definitely see inhibition chilling, corkscrewing that falls and everything like that. But usually if you have very good soil conditions, very good planting conditions, we tend to avoid some of those scenarios. Now, last week here, I've been looking at some of those planting conditions, and they vary a lot in my area. Fall strip till has been a little bit of a challenge. It looks like maybe it shed some of our late snowfall into the middle strips, and the strip itself is fairly dry and hard. Some of the early strip till was very crumbly, and it looked like those soil aggregates would maybe fall apart, especially if we had a rain. We did not get that, and some of those conditions is almost like literally almost like planting into gravel. So you can imagine about the air pockets and so forth that are in that soil, how dry it is. Where on the other hand, some of the no-till, some of the later spring strip till actually is really good, maybe almost a little bit too soft on the strip till, but in some of those conditions, we can run a little more down pressure on the planter and utilize that to maybe just firm up that soil just a little bit more. Now, should I be planting soybeans or corn over the next 10 days? So let's take a peek at what we learned from last year. I think this kind of helps solve a little bit of that question. Of course, none of us have a perfect crystal ball, but I want to go back to what we saw in corn last year. So this is the year in review from last year, looking at all the data after we were able to pull it in roughly December. And looking at this, I didn't have a lot of data for maybe that 16th through 18th of last year. But as we warmed up, soil conditions were actually decent earlier last year. We were on the dry side, just like this year. But we saw some pretty optimal yields early on, and even that third week of April. Now, as we got into that fourth week of April, you see a sharp downturn into some of the data there. That's when finally the winds caught up with us, the heat caught up with us, and our soil just became very hard, and it was really difficult to get some of those planters into the ground. Obviously, a lot of you guys remember that. We were breaking parts, just having a heck of a time debating about pre-watering a lot of stuff, and a lot of guys started doing that. But then we had a rain that followed about May 1st. So even with some of the pivots that fired up, we had the rain coming in. and we had a little bit of a delay in plant just to let that pass through. Now, some guys went back right away, and that's what we're seeing here. We had a cool turn down and wet. It's a little bit different than now, but we are turning cold here. And if you ran the pivots, it may be the same scenario that, hey, we're cold and wet now in that top, especially 2 inches. Now, last year, if you guys remember the rain, some of us got about an inch of rain in the area, and you're thinking, okay, well, we were so dry, an inch of rain disappeared pretty quick. But when we got into that field that soon, that top 2 inches, likely was still pretty wet. We may not have had actually as good conditions as we thought we were having. The planter went right in the ground, sure, but we were maybe a little bit wet, but more so we were cold. And you can see the impact on the yield that had in our area. Now, as you started to warm up, we had some great soil conditions at that point. Temperatures were increasing. It was a lot better off, and we actually recouped some of those yields even for being later on in the calendar date at that point. And then later on, we turned cool, and we had the calendar date working against us as well. So we saw, again, a downturn in yield at that point. Now, moving to soybeans, last year, this would have been a year to really test, hey, does early planting still pay on soybeans? And looking at the data, this is pulling a lot of data points throughout South Central Nebraska. We were able to maintain yield really well from that roughly 19th of April, about as soon as we got going last year in the area for the most part, and really held steady all the way across. Even here, hey, we were starting to get really hot and dry, again, getting to the point where it's hard to get planters in the ground. Actually, a lot of guys went to beans at that point because we couldn't get the corn planters in the ground that 2¼ inches or so like we'd like to see. Soil moisture wasn't maybe as consistent, just like we're seeing now. So a lot of guys did go to beans last year, and hey, we still held on to really good yield potential all the way through that. Now, we did have this widespread freeze on May 22nd. So all this data is original planted soybean fields. It's nothing to do with the replant. So this is also representing some stands that did get thinned out a little bit and probably were a little bit variable, but still had that planting date working for us last year. As you can see, as you got later, the trend still continues like what we see over really the 10-year data or so, which is typically we get into that second week of May or so, we do start to see yields downturn on soybeans. So all in all, just want to share a couple of those things with you guys, just food for thought. If I were to do anything, I would probably go ahead and switch to soybeans right now for a while as we get through some of these variable conditions, get some of those soybeans in the ground so we can move on to some of the other operations. And as weather improves, we can focus more of our attention back to corn, where we do see the impact of these variabilities play out more so than what we do with soybeans. Now, when it comes to watering, I would look at next week and maybe run some pivots. Soil conditions are highly variable out there. So do take a peek at that. If you've got chemistry on, you're planting soybeans, let's try to have some water on. I would say a few days before those soybeans are cracking through the surface. That just makes sure that we've got the chemistry mellowed out. We're not running some of that chemistry right into that trench or right onto the hypocotyl of that soybean, further impacting that stand. So good luck out there. Call if you guys need anything. That's what we're here for as a Pioneer team in South Central Nebraska. And have a great spring. Stay safe, and we'll see you around.